And now, your daily dose of debate, breaking news, and uncensored views. This is the Michael Medved Show.
And another great day in this greatest nation on God's green earth, but not all the news. Great news for this great nation. The news from the soccer pitch, the soccer field, the football field, not encouraging, as the New York Post said in a front page headline story. Belgium had a simple and savage post-game message for the U.S. last night. What was the message? Overturn this. The Red Devils, that's the name of the Belgian team, official X account posted alongside a photo of star Romelu Lukaku in the moment after their dominant 4-1 win over the United States men's national team at Seattle Stadium. A lot of upset, a lot of embarrassment. The Independent is writing about what it has called, following a Democratic U.S. Senator, Alex Padilla, the Trump effect. What is the Trump effect? You know what the Midas touch is? Everything he touches turns to gold. Well, there's the opposite. It's the Trump effect, at least according to analysis. And speaking of the Trump effect, the leader of the free world, the president of the United States, the runner-up for the Nobel Peace Prize, all of those distinctions, President Trump has landed in Turkey, in Ankara, the capital, and he is there for the NATO summit. But being there for the NATO summit doesn't stop him from criticizing our NATO allies, the European nations mostly, who are there for the purpose of trying to coordinate efforts to defend each other and to defend the civilized and decent and pro-Western, pro-American world against the threats of a resurgent China, Russia, an aggressive Russia that is trying to pull out all the stops to cause pain and death and destruction against Ukraine. With all of that going on, President Trump criticized the European allies, saying they had not helped the United States enough in our war against Iran, a war that is supposed to be on its way to solution. European allies saying they had not helped the United States in its war against Iran. He said Italy turned us down, and Germany turned us down, and France turned us down. He said during a meeting in Ankara with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, which is hosting this week's NATO summit. The Trump in Turkey this morning at the NATO summit, sitting across from Erdogan, he said this about the NATO summit in which he is participating, clip 66.
Well, that's what hurt my relationship with NATO, because Greenland doesn't help Denmark. Denmark doesn't spend money to really help Greenland, but it's an important part for the United States. And it's surrounded by China ships and Russian ships. And that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It was Greenland that, and it continues to be, that should be controlled by the United States, not by Denmark. And when they wouldn't go along with it, and with all the money we spend to help them with Russia, and we don't have to spend any money, we could remove all of our soldiers out of Europe. Because as you probably noticed, Europe's a very different place than it was 20 years ago. A lot different, much different. It's a much different, and they better be careful.
And they better be careful. And again, there's a piece in the Washington Post under the headline, Trump's NATO bashing casts shadow over U.S. pledge to defend allies. And it brings up the point that as a real estate and casino magnate, before he ever entered politics, he used to complain as he did in a 1990 interview with Playboy magazine, that the United States was, quote, defending wealthy nations for nothing, which would otherwise be wiped off the face of the earth in about 15 minutes. That was his attitude toward France, Britain, Germany, Italy, the rest of the NATO nations. 2 presidential wins later, writes the Washington Post, Trump has suggested repeatedly that he could quit NATO, the U.S.-led alliance built around the core premise that an attack against one is an attack on all. Trump has often treated allies with disdain, threatening earlier this year to seize Greenland, a territory of NATO ally Denmark. He claimed during the last campaign that he would encourage Russia to attack nations that don't spend enough on defense. And more recently, angry at European criticism of the Iran war, Trump said the U.S. might stop promising to defend its allies. As leaders of NATO's 32 nations gather in Turkey, they are set tomorrow to reaffirm commitment to the Mutual Defense Clause known as Article 5, which covers the Euro-Atlantic space. But in Europe, Trump's wavering on this core tenet of the Western alliance, writes the Washington Post, has forced a reckoning over whether the U.S. would, in fact, come to the rescue of its allies in an attack. There was rumors that were apparently deliberately set off by Russia that Russia would test NATO by attacking Poland, which is a tremendously important country and one of the largest, most militarily powerful and economically powerful of the former Soviet satellite countries. In Europe, Trump's wavering on this core tenet of the Western alliance has forced a reckoning over whether the U.S. would, in fact, come to the rescue of its allies in an attack. That seed of doubt alone suggests that the president might not need to withdraw the U.S. from NATO in order to undermine it very profoundly, officials say. And then the Post reports this fraught questioning is now complicated by U.S. plans to withdraw troops from the continent as European leaders increasingly warn that Russia may soon try to test their defenses. With all of this going on, President Trump had this to say, some additional thoughts about Denmark and the Denmark's Joint Arctic Command. Denmark is an ally of the United States. So what does the threat amount to? And all of a sudden, there is also a news item involving a terrorist organization that is not an ally of the United States by any means, Hamas. Hamas says it has dissolved its de facto government in Gaza, and they are replacing it with what exactly? We will try to get to that. There's also a big shakeup in the role to and the battle to control the U.S. Senate, with a very big change in a Senate race that the Democrats had been counting on winning, where it is now very doubtful that they would win. Why? Because some of the latest reaction to revelations about Graham Platner, the Democratic nominee for Senate in Maine, who it turns out is not just a sleazebag, not just a apparent Nazi sympathizer based on his chest tattoo, but he's also a rapist. We will get to that and to more coming up on the Medved Show. President Trump is in Ankara, Turkey, the capital of Turkey, which is a member of NATO, a crucial member of NATO, by the way, and President Trump acknowledged that during his visit this morning. And here, again, was President Trump's words after he'd gotten off the airplane and he was getting together with Tayyip Recep Erdogan, the virtual dictator of Turkey. Yes, he gets democratically elected from time to time, but he has been a strong man, as they say, in Turkey. And here was the message that President Trump tried to convey to our European allies who were joined together at Turkey to talk about our future pledges for mutual defense. President Trump sounded like this.
Well, that's what hurt my relationship with NATO, because Greenland doesn't help Denmark. Denmark doesn't spend money to really help Greenland, but it's an important part for the United States. And it's surrounded by China ships and Russian ships. And that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It was Greenland that and it continues to be, that should be controlled by the United States, not by Denmark. And when they wouldn't go along with it, and with all the money we spend to help them with Russia, and we don't have to spend any money, we could remove all of our soldiers out of Europe. Because as you probably noticed, Europe's a very different place than it was 20 years ago. A lot different, much different. It's a much different, and they better be careful.
They better be careful. Well, they better be careful or they get taken in by two very substantial lies that President Trump just told. He said that Denmark doesn't do anything to take care of Greenland. Denmark spends approximately $5.6 billion. Well, actually, their currency is the Danish kroner, the DKK. That's every year. It's roughly 6.3 billion to 800 billion of U.S. dollars. This is on core financial support and administration for Greenland. However, due to recent geopolitical tensions and Arctic security concerns, Denmark has pledged an additional number of billions of dollars in new infrastructure, healthcare, and military spending packages, partially to defend them against a potential U.S. attack. This is reported by the BBC. Meanwhile, he also talked about there were Chinese ships or submarines operating off the coast of Greenland, near Greenland. It is not true. There are currently no Chinese ships or submarines operating anywhere near Greenland. That, according to Denmark's Joint Arctic Command and NATO intelligence, such claims are unsubstantiated, with the last recorded voyage of a Chinese vessel near the region occurring 10 years ago. Also, he always rips our allies and seldom has the same kind of message to our enemies. Would he ever tell Putin, you better be careful? Well, of course we have to be careful. They have to be careful. And then there was this message by President Trump to the leader of Turkey, Erdogan, and speaking about, because Erdogan is an authoritarian and he is not someone who believes in democratic governance, he has these words of friendship and support for the Islamist-tinted Erdogan. This is clip 83.
Landing at the airport, this is such a beautiful airport, and to have as everybody knows, it's been very much reported, we are great friends. The president has done an incredible job. Just landing at the airport, this is such a beautiful airport, and to have a building named after me, I'm very happy about that. That was very nice. The airport is absolutely beautiful. The roads coming in were brand new and beautiful, and he's been a great leader and a respected leader all over the world. And we really do. We've had right from the beginning good chemistry. We've had a very special relationship.
Okay, Erdogan is not respected all over the world. He is feared in many places because he is an autocrat. And by the way, the idea that he had a building named after him in Turkey, it's not to honor him. A building complex in Turkey named after Donald Trump, it is known as the Trump Towers, Istanbul. The property consists of two conjoined 39-story skyscrapers, one for offices and one for residential use, connected at the base by a shopping mall. Developed by the Turkish company Dogan Holding, it was the first Trump-branded property built on the European continent. If you consider Turkey the European continent, there's debate about that. Although the complex continues to bear the name, the Trump organization never owned the buildings. Instead, they were built under a licensing agreement for the use of his name, which they thought would work well for them in Turkey. That's according to the New York Times. Then Trump could not speak in Turkey without mentioning the so-called rigged election, his favorite subject, of 2020. Listen to clip 78.
I've been doing this for now sort of a long time. If you count the 4 years where we had a rigged election, I was very much into politics then too. But I spent the first 4 years, I spent 4 years in a little different state. And then we've had an amazing, probably the best year maybe ever had by an American president. When you look at the economy, we have the greatest economy we've ever had. We have $19 trillion, $19.2 trillion to be exact, being invested in the United States. That's 7 or 8 times more than it's ever had. It's a world record, not just a U.S. record. And I just read where, in fact, coming over, I was in the car with those beautiful horses, those great riders, those great soldiers, and it came over the wires that Toyota is moving out of Mexico into the United States and building one of the biggest truck and car plants ever built. It's amazing. That's what tariffs do, if properly used. And
okay, Toyota is not entirely leaving Mexico, but it is shifting a major portion of its Tacoma pickup truck production to the U.S. This move is primarily driven by U.S. tariffs and stalled trade agreements, which make it more expensive to import vehicles and parts from abroad. More coming up. And on the Michael Medved Show, one of the big issues that they're going to be discussing at this NATO get-together in Turkey has to do with providing more equipment to our allies. And yes, they are our allies, whatever President Trump may say at the moment, but our allies in Ukraine, who, by the way, just scored a huge victory, and it's a victory over some equipment that was held in Russia, in Siberia. Now, if you look at a map and you see where Ukraine is, and for them to be able to launch a successful strike on Russian facilities in Siberia, this is impressive. And it should encourage people. Meanwhile, President Trump in Turkey was asked about Russian missile defense. Here's what he had to say. Clip 95.
About with what?
Russia, Ukraine. Did Putin seem open to any concessions? That he
never changed. I just don't want him killing people. It doesn't affect the United States. When Biden was here, he gave them hundreds of billions of dollars worth of equipment. Now I sell the equipment for, fair price, the full price. And I sell it not to Ukraine, I sell it to the European Union. They pay us. But with me, it's not anything to do other than I'd like to save lives. And I would like to see, it doesn't affect us. It's really, it's far away. It affects Europe much more. We're there to help Europe, but it doesn't affect the United States. We have an ocean in between.
We have made promises to Ukraine since our alliance really formally began in 1992, which is when President Trump was still trying to save various casinos and not thinking about geopolitics in any meaningful sense. Despite President Trump's gripe, and this is the Washington Post writing, which he reasserted over the weekend, that U.S. allies are not there for us. The only time in all of history that NATO triggered Article 5. Article 5 is where there's an attack on one, it's an attack on all. The only time in history that NATO triggered Article 5 was after the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attack on the United States. It's supposed to be a no-brainer. This is a statement by Camille Grand, who is a former NATO official who is now Secretary General of the main European Defense Industry Association. It's supposed to be a no-brainer, he said, the sort of musketeer one for all for one commitment, no matter what, and so on. So we end up in a situation where there are more doubts than with any other president in recent history, at least, which makes the Europeans very nervous. Some European leaders recently have become more blunt about the impact. French President Macron warned after Trump's last threat to leave NATO that the alliance is worth what is left unsaid. That is, the trust behind it. If you create doubt instead of trust every day about your commitment, you strip that commitment of substance, Macron said. The faltering confidence in U.S. guarantees, especially when there's talk about using force, military force, to take over Greenland from Denmark. The idea that this faltering confidence has been costly because it has caused a number of the NATO nations to rearm and take more ownership of NATO, which the U.S. has led since its founding after World War II. What Article 5 implies, especially for smaller nations and the former Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe, is the prospect that a U.S. president would bring the full force of American military might to bear if any one of them is attacked. For a NATO ally such as Denmark, which faced Trump's bid for Greenland, the promise of U.S. help in an attack can ring hollow after staring down the prospect of being attacked itself by U.S. forces. What a disaster. After the 9/11 attacks, NATO allies deployed aircraft to help patrol U.S. airspace and naval forces to the Mediterranean. European nations, including Germany and Denmark, sent troops to fight alongside U.S. forces in Afghanistan, getting embroiled in America's longest war, which some in Europe later regretted after the chaotic 2021 withdrawal. What is predictable is that the U.S. wants Europeans to do more, and that they there may be several theaters of conflict in which we must assume our responsibility. So said Alice Ruffo, who was France's deputy defense minister, suggesting there is little use in contemplating the volatility of U.S. policy where there is work to do. In any case, our approach to alliances rests on credibility, trust, and predictability, Ruffo added, which I believe is a very powerful strategic tool in the current context. A strategic tool. Meanwhile, it means that President Trump has, arriving in Turkey, has turned away from his recent involvement as a critic of the officiating that has been part of the FIFA World Cup Soccer Championship. A star player, a striker named Balogun, that star player from the United States team was handed a red card in the U.S. match versus Bosnia and Herzegovina at the World Cup. That would have forced him to miss last night's showdown with Belgium, a showdown, unfortunately, which the U.S. team lost 4-1. But the star player, played, and it didn't make any difference. We still lost 4-1. Yesterday, President Trump said ahead of the U.S. match with Belgium that it needed to be overturned. This is clip 47.
This game would have a big mark on it. If we lost, if we won, no matter what happened, you have to let them use their best players. And the game tonight's going to be amazing, and we're going to have a full team, and Belgium's going to have a full team. And you know what? If they beat us, then they can be really proud. The other way, if they beat us, we'll say it was rigged, just like the election was rigged in 2020, but I won't get into that.
What do you mean you won't get into that? You live in that. Can you believe that he brings up the 2020 election when talking about an American player who got a red card is going to miss, but he didn't miss it because President Trump made a phone call to Giannino, the head of the Hockey Association of FIFA, and got that player reinstated. It didn't help. Something else that isn't helping the Democrats is one of the candidates they have been counting on to help them take control from the U.S. Senate in the midterm elections. That candidate is in a heap of trouble. He's been in trouble for a long time. His name, Graham Platner. What's wrong now? Everything. We'll get to that coming up on the Medved Show. And on the Michael Medved Show, there are a series, some 34 races going on, some of them non-competitive at all, some of them overwhelmingly leading to one side or the other. But there are 34 races for the U.S. Senate taking place, and none of them has attracted more attention than the race in Maine for the Senate seat held by Susan Collins, who is a Republican. She's a moderate Republican. She is the Republican nominee, and she has been running against a Democratic nominee, with the polling for the race being almost even. It shows Graham Platner, the Democratic nominee, with 49% of the vote, and Senator Collins, who has been holding that seat for 3 terms, she is at 47%. So it's within the margin of error, a very close race, but not anymore, because suddenly there are headlines like this headline from the Washington Post. And remember, Washington Post is a Democratic-leaning paper, and Graham Platner is a Democrat. He's the Democratic nominee. He won the nomination from the governor of Maine, who had an age problem. She's 78 years old. But she may be needed to be called upon for a rescue effort, because the Washington Post headline says top Democrats pull Graham Platner endorsements, call on him to end his Maine Senate campaign. Why? Because he has been credibly accused of rape. And that accusation is very different from the idea of previous accusations that he's received about sexting, about sending people material in the mail. This is about full out, unsanctioned sex and a sexual attack. The way that it's described is Jenny Rassicot, who is a woman who previously dated Platner, told the Washington Post that he sexually assaulted her in her main home in 2021. Rassicot said Platner came to her home drunk, climbed on top of her on the couch, and then had non-consensual sex with her in her bedroom. I remember saying, hey, I'm not into this. And like, don't do that. Don't touch me, she told the Post, like saying every way that I could think of, no. This allegation was first reported on Monday by Politico. And then they add that Platner is challenging Senator Susan Collins in a race that is pivotal to control of the Senate, where right now the Republicans have a 3-seat advantage. So if they lose 3 seats, they lose control of the Senate. Jenny Rassico, who made this accusation, has also now appeared on CNN with Jake Tapper. And she sounds like this in terms of her narrative about what happened to her. Clip 14.
He was heavily intoxicated, had intentions with me, and wasn't listening when I said no. And
you were saying, no, don't, over and over.
I remember, obviously I've had to recall a lot of this. This is something that I tried for many years to forget. And so small details, might get past me. But yes, I remember very specifically saying, I'm not into this. I remember that the most, sort of saying that the most firmly. I remember specifically him like grabbing at my chest, and I like hit his hand and I said, don't touch me. And I remember that during the altercation.
And then he kept going.
Yeah.
I know that you have been very reluctant to tell this story. Very reluctant.
Yeah.
I'm actually surprised you're here.
Thrown up 3 times today.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Why did you ultimately decide to do it? Why come forward?
A few reasons. One of the biggest ones is that I think that there are a lot of men in this world relying on the silence of women.
Okay, and she is not going to be part of that silence. And she went on to address those who still plan to vote for Platner if he remains a name on the ballot. This, again, is Jenny Rassico, who made the accusation of an unwanted and a resisted forced sexual act by Graham Platner. And this is not many years ago, like the accusation about the molestation in the dressing room in a department store in New York. That for President Trump was decades ago. This is not. This is something within the last decade and more pressing, obviously, for the witness and the victim. Again, Jenny Rassico, clip 13.
There are going to be Democrats who say, I believe you, but I don't care.
Yeah.
I'm going to vote for him anyway because we need a progressive voice in the United States Senate. Mm-hmm. Are you going to be okay with that? Are you going to be able to handle that? I'm not saying it's the right answer or the right response, but
no, I have friends who feel that way, and that's been a hard pill to swallow. And I guess I need to not ask potentially. Maybe I need to not ask in order to not care what they do. I understand that the state of our political environment is so much so that we need a lot of change. And he's offering that change. And, I'm not mad at anyone who has voted for him all along. If he wasn't who he was, I would be voting for him as well. And going forward, I don't know what's going to happen.
Okay, the lady you just heard, Jenny Rassico, is a 41-year-old Maine resident who claimed a heavily intoxicated Platner entered her home uninvited in late 2021. So we're talking about when Joe Biden was president. It's not so long ago. That is when he forced himself on her despite her protests. In a video posted on X, Platner responded to the accusations this way. This is Graham Platner talking about the future of his campaign and his response to the charge of rape.
I wanted to directly address the troubling, serious, and false allegations against me. Any accusation of non-consensual behavior is categorically false. Regardless of the inaccuracy of the reporting, but mindful of the political reality it will inflict, we are taking the time to reflect on the best path forward for the state that I love, the people that I love, the movement I belong to, and the goal of defeating Susan Collins. Those were the goals when we launched this campaign, and they remain my goals today.
One of the questions people ask about this is, how did he get into her house? Well, they had been dating. He knew about her entrance and her entrances and exits, and he knew that she left her door open, and he let himself in. And now he is going to reflect on the best path forward. What I think is very typical of the response, even of his fellow Democrats, who are particularly upset about what this means for the Democratic brand. That's particularly true for Bernie Sanders, who was one of the people who encouraged Graham Platner from the beginning of his ultra-progressive campaign. And Sanders said of the candidate, CNN's Aaron Blake reported on what Sanders had to say. He helped the candidate rise to a primary victory, but he said, I have spoken with Graham Platner about the best path forward for Maine. In light of these very serious allegations, I have recommended that he step aside. And the series of scandals involving Graham Platner, you could say, start with a tattoo that he got 18 years ago. And it was a Nazi tattoo. It's an unmistakably Nazi tattoo called a Totenkopf, for a death's head, that was tattooed on his chest. A recent poll showed Platner leading Republican incumbent Susan Collins 49% to 47%. Not taken today, taken before these revelations. So where do we go from here, and what's the reaction of other prominent politicians? We'll get to that and more in this greatest nation on God's green earth.